For joining us today. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We're thrilled to have so many of you here today for this really interesting conversation. I was discussing with our panelists who are not people maybe you were all familiar with, why we wanted to have this sort of two-part event today. As those of you who are regulars at WITA know, we are frequently discussing the trade issues, the tariffs, tranche 1, tranche 2, 232, CSIS, the various issues in trade, USMCA. We've had many events about China and US-China trade issues. But we thought, and the board of WITA thought it would be a good idea to take a step back also in the midst of this ongoing dispute on trade to talk about the larger context. So we reached out to friends and people in our network and asked them for some of the best ideas for some of the best people we could get to speak about the US-China strategic relationship and still have that conversation about trade. So that's what this two-part event is today, to discuss the strategic relationship, which in some of our communications we also call the rivalry, and also to talk about the trade dispute that's ongoing with a really fantastic panel coming up. So we hope everyone will stick around for both parts of this conversation. We have a busy fall calendar that's in process. We have an event on trade development scheduled. If you look at the back of your calendar, your back of your package. We have an FDA boot camp coming up in about 4 weeks in November. We're beginning planning for our International Trade Conference, which will be February 4th. If those of you who came last year, it was a sold-out affair. We expect a similar turnout again this year and hope you'll consider attending that, as well as potentially sponsoring if that's something that's in your budgets. With that, I'm going to turn our discussion over to our first panel. Jake Parker from the US-China Business Council is our moderator today. Jake actually is kindly joining us again today after being with us last week. I'm not sure if any of you were there, but we held an intensive trade seminar last week. This was a 2-day event where we had 12 different panels discussing how U.S. government makes trade policy. That was an off-the-record session, and it was our biggest turnout yet, with over 180 attendees for that. It was a great event, and Jake did a fantastic job, and after that we reached out and see if he'd be willing to moderate this discussion, because he had a lot of really interesting insights. We're really glad to have you back, Jake. Thank you for doing this. Thanks to Richard, Patty, and Jude for joining us as well. Really pleased to have all of you here today.
Ken, thanks so much. As he said, my name is Jake Parker. I'm with the US-China Business Council. I'm a bit of a bridge between the strategic discussion, which we'll be having today in the first panel, and the trade discussion, which will be happening directly afterwards. But first, let me briefly introduce our panelists. You have their bios in front of you as well. Richard Fontaine is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center of New American Security. Before his current position, he had a long history of government service, working as a policy advisor for Senator McCain, as well as time in the National Security Council, Department of State, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Next, we have Dr. Patricia Kim, and she is the Senior Policy Analyst at the United States Institute of Peace. Before her current position, Dr. Kim was a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, and a research fellow at Kennedy School of Government. And last, we have Jude Blanchette. He's the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for International and Strategic Studies. Before his current role, Jude led the China practice of Crumpton Group, spent over a decade in Beijing, leading the Conference Board China Center's research on China's political environment. Thank you all for joining us today. So let's jump right into the panel, and I'll begin by asking each of the panelists one question. Mr. Fontaine, I'd like to begin with you. To help frame today's discussion, would you please discuss some of your recent research on the great power competition between the US and China?
Sure, and thanks for having all of us. It's interesting that the folks who are working on trade are interested in the strategic competition between the United States and China and its implications for trade. There are also implications for the trade frictions between the United States and China that are strategic in nature and that become a more important, probably than in the past, element of this competition that we're going to talk about today. Just to go back a little bit, one of the premises that was built into the U.S. approach to China, going back to the years of Bill Clinton and when there was a Republican Congress in the late 1990s and so on, was that deep engagement with China, especially but not exclusively on the economic front, would lead to the long-term liberalization of China, if not democratization, but the long-term liberalization of China. Ideas can't be stopped at the borders any better than goods or capital can, and so there was this strategic case for China's entry in the WTO, for deep trade ties with China, deep capital flow and investment ties, et cetera. I would say that assumption that the economic engagement would lead to liberalization went out the window in the minds of most policymakers in Washington at least 5 or 6 years ago. For some of them, it was well before that, but clearly when Xi Jinping came to power and really started to feel his oats in the wake of the global financial crisis and started to actually become more repressive at home rather than less. So that element of US policy, that kind of assumption or premise kind of dropped away. There was a second one that was built into US-China policy, which is that as China grew in strength and in stature and in economic prosperity, it would become more and more of a responsible stakeholder, which is the sort of key term in the liberal international order, that it would have more skin in the game, it would have more to lose by the deterioration of the rules, and it would become more of an upholder of those rules. And while you can still find people that say, well, on balance, China is on that path, that's I would say today, a small minority of folks who are working in the policy world, and those people think that in fact China will only pursue support of the rules as they exist that it finds in its interest. It will replace the ones, or attempt to replace the ones that it finds not in its interest. And it will be more or less ambivalent on other ones. That's maybe an obvious observation, but it's different than what the premise was before. And so the falling away of those two assumptions and the rise in recent years of greater Chinese assertiveness in places like South China Sea, China's One Belt, One Road infrastructure projects, and you can sort of go around and look at its own kind of repressive actions at home and so forth, have really led to a recasting among most people in the policy environment. Washington is China's a strategic competitor. And then the interesting debate is, okay, well, what the hell does that mean, to be a strategic competitor? Does this mean a competitor like we were a competitor to the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Well, no, not really. Does it mean exclusively a competitor? No, it doesn't mean that either, because we still have a strong economic relationship with China. We still do diplomacy with China. Does it mean confrontation? No, not necessarily. Does it mean conflict? And right now the debate is about how to define the terms of competition with China. Do we decouple elements of our economy from China's, particularly on the technology side, where we think they might beat us and have bad national security outcomes? Is it even broader than that? How do we compete for allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific, for example? Is the Middle East a commons for competition where if China sort of is successful, it's bad for us, and if we're successful, it's bad for China? And that's sort of the terms of the debate now, and we can get into precisely what that means in practice, but maybe that helps to frame kind of where we are, I think, today.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, just picking up on something that Mr. Fontaine said, particularly around competition for allies in East Asia, I wonder how you would contextualize how US-China competition might play out in different regions, particularly in East Asia.
Great. First of all, I want to thank Ken and WITA for inviting me here to this panel today. I think Richard did a great job of laying out sort of the broad contours of this great power competition and sort of how we're struggling to define where it's going to go in different regions. And before I focus in on East Asia, I want to outline Beijing's strategy, what I think is Beijing's strategy for competing with the US and how it's tried to pitch itself to the world. So there's been a lot of attention paid recently on sort of Beijing's growing military capabilities. If you were watching the news yesterday, there was a 70th anniversary parade in Beijing where it brought out all these sophisticated weapons. And I think there's no doubt that China wants to become a world-class military power, and it's important to keep our eyes on this. But I would say China, generally speaking, seeks to cultivate economic prowess as its means to rise to the top. And it's much less interested, at least so far, in surpassing the United States as the world's greatest military power or taking on the role of providing global security like the United States has over the last several decades. I think instead it wants to position itself as the economic partner of choice, and it sees this as its primary means to winning friends and influence around the world. Now, some of the terminology the Chinese government has used to sort of capture this is, you would have probably heard slogans like win-win cooperation or building a community of common destiny. And Chinese leaders have pushed hard on this idea that they are, quote, a new type of great power that simply wants to set aside politics and do economic development. Now, not many outside Beijing find this narrative convincing, and there's a lot of skepticism for good reason. I think there are many instances where China has been willing to use its economic leverage or flex its military muscles to try to get different states to take its preferences into account. But having said that, I think much of this competition is going to be playing out in the economic realm, especially as you move further away afield from China's borders. And it's ultimately going to be over who can win hearts and minds based on demonstrating a sustained commitment to economic and diplomatic engagement around the world. But I think if you had to pick the region where the risk of actual military confrontation between the United States and China is highest, it would be East Asia for obvious reasons. This is China's immediate neighborhood, where there are many long-standing flashpoints from Taiwan to the East and South China Seas to the Korean Peninsula. And to take the Korean Peninsula as an example, this is an arena where China has demonstrated willingness to intervene militarily, as we saw almost exactly 69 years ago in October 1950 when China entered the Korean War. Now, this wasn't a decision that China made lightly. It came at a horrible time for China, actually, because it was just 1 year into establishing the PRC. It came at also great strategic and human cost. But it's notable that they were willing to intervene nonetheless to push back on what they saw as U.S. encroaching, closer to its borders. So Beijing certainly does not want another war on the Korean Peninsula. It's relatively comfortable, I think, with where it stands today. It's relieved that President Trump doesn't seem to be interested in going back to the days of fire and fury anytime soon. And I think it's satisfied with the fact that the United States and North Korea are likely to be tied down, in negotiations over years on this issue of denuclearization. China's primary objectives today in the region, and especially on the Korean Peninsula, include maintaining stability, preventing war, and gradually rolling back the United States' presence in the region, while integrating North and South Korea, as well as other countries, into its economic orbit. But I think it's important to note that this doesn't mean that the two Koreas, let alone the rest of East Asia, will be aligning, completely with China anytime soon or jumping on that bandwagon. So there were polls released yesterday by the Pew Research Center that show that by and large, most East Asians still believe that having the United States as the greatest power in the region is clearly in their best interests. There's a lot of skepticism about Xi Jinping, about the CCP's intention. And I think this has to do with the fact that East Asians have struggled with Chinese domination over centuries. They don't want to live under Beijing's shadow. And it also has to do with the fact that the United States political system of democracy, respect for individual freedom, rule of law, all of these things that underpin US soft power in the region truly resonate with publics in South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and even in China, where I think many citizens and elites alike are increasingly disturbed by the way Xi Jinping has taken the country, not the company. So I would end by noting that I don't think the U.S. should take these positive views in the region for granted. It certainly doesn't help when the U.S. president is talking about our alliances in transactional terms, or we're failing to mediate between, Japan and South Korea, two of our most important allies, when they're locked in a dispute. And whether and how the United States chooses to stay engaged in the region will have a huge impact on the course of China's own political choices, as well as the choices that South Korea, Japan, and even North Korea have on the table as they figure out how to live with the rising China on their borders. So I think the primary challenge for the United States going forward in this, great power competition will be, finding a way to demonstrate to our allies and partners that we're not simply enlisting them in a Cold War against China, which no one has an interest in joining, and that demonstrating a sustained, comprehensive engagement in the region and in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. So Jude, we've gotten a bit of the broad geostrategic perspective, particularly from a U.S. government perspective. We've heard from Dr. Kim on the regional competition. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the domestic Chinese political lens through which the U.S.-China relationship is being viewed and what the implications are for the future of the bilateral relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. And I should say at the outset, one of the benefits of working on Chinese domestic politics, which Jake said is rather opaque, is I can say essentially anything and no one can prove me wrong. The downside of it is you need to constantly be saying things about Chinese opaque political system at a time where it's increasingly difficult to say anything about China's opaque political system. So most of us China analysts spent the past 48 hours parsing over the video footage of the 70th anniversary parade in Beijing and looking for how tall Xi Jinping was standing, how many people have to prop up former General Secretary Jiang Zemin, who's been rumored to die, I think, 100 of the past 99 years. But nonetheless, this is really important because, as both panelists have said this morning, we are locked in, whatever you want to call it, Cold War 2.0, a new frenemy relationship, a new enemy relationship. This problem of how we coexist, compete with China has been around for a long time, and missing out of that equation for a very long time has been looking at and taking seriously evolutions in China's domestic political system, specifically understanding the Communist Party of China, which for the better part of the past 4 decades you could essentially ignore, or it felt like we could ignore it because we all thought we knew the trajectory that China was headed on, and it was, post-Soviet collapse, end of history, Coca-Cola, blue jeans, the internet, WTO. And then suddenly, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, folks began to wake up that something was happening in China. We began to see the sickle and hammer on banners on the streets of Beijing. Jake and I were both living at the time in Beijing, and you began to notice symbolically and meaningfully a re-rise of the Communist Party. And so, if you just humor me for a second, I want to quote a speech from Deng Xiaoping, from one of his best speeches, I should add, of his many good speeches. But August 18th, 1980, Deng Xiaoping is giving a speech. Remember, China's just emerged out of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao in 1976, and Deng, who's looking to strengthen and solidify party control, but do that through a modernization project for China. And he looks around at the political wreckage and he says there's 4 problems the Communist Party's got to deal with if it wants to stay in power, if China's going to modernize. Number 1, we can't again have an over-centralization of power in the top leader. Number 2, we can't have the top leader doing too much, essentially being a bottleneck of all bottlenecks. We've got to have the leader focus on their core priorities and delegate responsibilities. Number 3, we can't have the Communist Party butting into the responsibilities of the government, the state council. We've got to have a division of labor where the party is looking at the overall political trajectory and it leaves up the day-to-day management of China to the technocracy in the state council. And number 4, we've got to deal with the long-term problem of leadership succession. And as I was watching the parade yesterday, and I always have this Deng Xiaoping speech in the back of my mind because it so accurately describes the 4 pathologies that have reemerged into Chinese politics, there's a striking moment where what's it called? What do they have in Macy's Day Parades? A float was coming down, or a big picture that's being driven through the streets, and it's of Xi Jinping. In a scene that can only remind you of a time travel back to the Maoist period, or going a little bit to the east of China to North Korea in terms of the symbolism of it. And it's jarring for those of us who have been working on China for a long time to see the reemergence of the old ways of politics in China. And so it begs a question of where is China headed? And this to me is as much driving the frustrations and frictions in the relationship and very much animating U.S. policy on China is it's really the first moment in a while we actually don't have a good answer of where China is going. And if you take a trip to Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, you can be convinced that China is very much on the same trajectory of what we thought it was 10 years ago. You've got the bright shiny buildings. You've got the multinational corporations who are operating there, many of Jake's clients, member companies, I should say. Sorry, Jake. But nonetheless, if you were to go a few thousand miles to the west of Beijing, you'd be in Xinjiang, where there is a full and total surveillance state, which is detaining upwards of, depending on your estimate, your lowball estimate is 1 million, higher estimates at 2 million. We're seeing the seeds of the Communist Party's actions in Hong Kong right now, where we have a full-on independent political movement, which is advocating for, they may not say it, but advocating for possible separation from the mainland. You have in Taiwan an election which is tipping towards at one time, a few months ago, way back a few months ago, the DPP candidate Tsai Ing-wen, who has seen a massive bump in the polls based on what's happening in Hong Kong. So I don't have any answers on all of this, but I think as we're looking at what the U.S. should be doing and where we see the bilateral relationship going, and even on more narrow questions of what will happen in the current trade negotiations, taking very seriously and on its own terms how the Communist Party of China is articulating its goals, how it's governing China, and thinking through what that means for the political evolution of the country is extraordinarily important. And up till this moment, we really haven't done a good job, all of us, of spending time thinking through that challenge.
Thank you, Jude. I picked up on a theme that the three panelists have been talking about, and I think Mr. Fontaine put it perfectly at the beginning, and I'll ask this first question to you, sir. I think that there was a feeling when China joined the WTO, particularly among those in the United States economic community who helped negotiate the agreement, that China would become more liberalized, that it would move forward its economic reform, that it would become a responsible stakeholder, as you mentioned, ostensibly that it would become more like the United States, and it would integrate more fully into the international community. And I think you said it perfectly, as did Jude and Dr. Kim, that these expectations are not coming to fruition. I was in Beijing a few weeks ago meeting with a senior Chinese government official, and we laid this out for him. And what we said was that this thesis of what China would become is now a vacuum, because there's a realization it's not becoming that thing. And in that vacuum, we filled it with fear of China's intentions, of what China is seeking to do in its expansion in the South China Sea, in its economic policy, in its Belt and Road. I just wonder, from your perspective, we've lost this original thesis of what China would become. We now have a period where we're trying to evaluate the direction forward. Could you talk a little bit about how we're going to go about developing a new thesis and what you think that thesis might become?
Sure. So it's always interesting to talk to our Chinese friends when you say, well, the United States assumed that, given the kinds of steps that we took and China took, that you'd become more liberal over the years. And they said, well, who told you that? We didn't say that. So we just assumed that. So it's not our fault if your assumption fell to the wayside. As a policy planner, as a strategic planner in the policymaking world, you look at capabilities and intentions. And if you look at the capability side, clearly China is increasingly prosperous. Even though its growth rates may be going down, they're still positive. And therefore has more resources to put against whatever its national security objectives are. If you look at the military side, China has made major investments, not only in modernizing its military, but in acquiring offensive capabilities that are directly designed to counter U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. Aircraft carrier killing missiles and what they call anti-access area denial capabilities, things like that. And so on the capabilities front, now if this was Britain acquiring these capabilities, we would say, oh, great, because they're an ally of ours and they share our fundamental values and most of our interests, depending on what you think about Brexit. China then gets to what are their intentions, and there it's unclear what their long-term intentions are, and it's hard, of course, when you talk about whose intentions and over what period of time are you talking about their intentions and so forth. But the indications from an American perspective are not good. Whether you look at the increasing degree of repression at home and the way that China believes a population should be governed in places like Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or the way that countries in the region should be subject to economic coercion. So, for example, experiencing a boycott, essentially, of rare earth minerals after a spat with Japan or South Korea, being subject to a boycott of Latte's economic activity after its agreement to host American anti-missile capabilities and things like anti-aircraft capabilities, anti-missile capabilities, or interference in the domestic politics in Australia. You see, you sort of look around the region for indicators, and whether it's political interference or economic coercion, or the building these military capabilities, or domestic repression, or the surveillance state, which it also seeks to export those capabilities to other autocracies around the world. None of that really accords with the way the United States is fundamentally frames its interests and values. And then the question is, okay, well, what do you do about all of this? And that's when we get back to this notion of competition. And that there are specific areas where China is going to act internationally that the United States needs to counter, or not just the United States, but those who have a shared interest. And that's when it gets to the allies and partners and all that stuff. Yet there's going to still be areas in which cooperation may be the wrong term, but we have engagement with China, whether it is diplomatic cooperation on the Iran file, for example, or continued economic engagement with China. And it's that balance of how much of what we're talking about is going to be fundamentally competitive, zero sum, you win, we lose, and vice versa, and therefore we need to counter their influence, their growth in different parts of the world, and how much of this can remain cooperative. That's the framework that is quickly replacing all the stuff before. But there's a lot of disagreement about what those proportions are. I mean, in an absolute sense, some people would say it's all competitive and we should decouple our economies, because if they get richer, that fundamentally harms us, even if we would get richer because of the trade. And then other people say, no, it's totally the opposite. Most people are saying, well, it's somewhere in the middle, but the big argument is about what are those proportions? What's the proportion of competitiveness and what's the proportion of not?